Welcome back, everybody. I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Lee, we got a weird one today. You want to intro this one?
You keep saying it's weird. I don't know. I kind of find it romantic. Maybe I'm just a weird guy.
Lee's pretty sentimental about his stories with love affairs between human beings and inanimate objects.
Yeah. You know. So today we're looking at a story from the Liao Zhai Zhi. It's a collection of short stories or longer short stories, some of them written by Pu Songling in the late Ming, early Qing. I think it was published in the early Qing. Pu Songling is an interesting character. He's revered amongst Chinese literary types, not because he's that great of he's not like the guy who you go to study when you do like classical Chinese literature, but he's the guy who everyone loves to read. We have a professor here, Roy Chan, who is like this heavy, intense, very much into that kind of like politically minded modern Chinese literature. But when you hear him talk about Pu Songling, it's like a joy for him. It's something that he read growing up. It's actually one of the things that I personally read when I got into Chinese studies. And so I'm really excited that we're discussing this story, which is Shi Qing Xu. So that is translated as Rare Stone from Heaven.
Rare Stone from Heaven. By the way, do you know who the translator is for this?
Overall?
No, just for this story, but I don't know if it says on there, but
Hu Shiguang.
Hu Shiguang. Okay.
So, but this series of tales, Liao Zhai Zhi, sometimes known as Strange Tales from Liao Zhai Studios, sometimes Strange Tales from Make Do Studios. It has a number of translators.
Right.
So,
but when it says Tales of the Strange or Strange Tales, they are very strange.
So it actually covers a wide variety of things when it covers strange things. You know, this story is about a man and his love for his stone and the stone's love back for him. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's just like a story about foreigners, about like English people like coming to Guangzhou with their red hair and being all crazy foreigner stuff. And, you know, there's a pretty wide variety of topics covered.
And I'm curious, we usually prep these. We didn't prep this when we decided to go ahead and wing it. So I'm curious to hear how you read it, because I read this. Well, we'll see what you make of it. Yeah. But so the essential spine of the story, and it's a very short one, is a guy has this, I'm going to go ahead and use the word fetish for stones. He collects them. He buys anything he can find, any stone he can find. And he's out fishing one day and catches in his net this very peculiar, very large stone with holes all over it.
Which is already a romantic
Which is already fairly sexualized. Yeah. He puts it on display, fawns over it. And through the rest of the story, various people come and either try to or succeed in stealing it from him. He gets it back. They get it back. Except for there's one guy that shows up.
There's one guy in the middle, and I'm not sure what to make of that guy.
Because he doesn't come back. He shows up, talks about it, and leaves.
And he has magical abilities, and he has a relationship. The guy who we're talking about, we don't actually learn his name. The story tells us that Xing Yunfei, who is the hero of this story, he asks for his name several times and never gets it. But he is able to kind of like magic the stone and magically move the stone in different ways, and it's just a really kind of weird.
And so this particular strange person tells Mr. Xing, who has the stone, A, belongs to my family. I want it back. And Mr. Xing begs him, please don't take it. I'll acknowledge it's yours. Just let me keep it. The guy says, fine. You can do that.
Well, he takes it at first.
He does take it at first.
He magically disappears it, and Xing is
freaking out.
He's freaking out and chases after the man.
And he identifies, the strange man does, exactly the number of holes on the stone.
92 holes.
92 holes. And the guy, Mr. Xing, says, please let me keep it. And the guy says, I'll tell you what, I'll let you keep it, but it's going to take 3 years off of your life. Mm-hmm. And he seals 3 of the holes.
And what's interesting about that is it's not that it's just the unidentified man's stone, but he says he was going to take it from him for a short period of time, I guess 3 years. And because the stone actually was so excited to see Xing Yunfei that he appeared to Xing Yunfei. The stone appeared to Xing Yunfei 3 years too early.
Yeah.
And so essentially what the story is about is it's about Xing Yunfei and his life fated with the stone. He and the stone are supposed to live together happily until he's 92, when Xing Yunfei is going to die. Mm-hmm. But because the stone comes early, because the stone is excited to see Xing Yunfei, so he has to lose 3 years of his life with the stone, which is essentially 3 years of his life. And so when the unidentified man takes the stone, he just briefly takes it and marks out 3 of those holes with his 2 fingers. So he kind of squishes them.
Yeah. And so by the end of the story, Xing Yunfei dies. Stone is dropped and cracks the same year because they're fated to die together, and that's the end of the story. So it's a story of a love affair between a man and a rock.
And that's a good way to put it. What's interesting is in the end of the story, we find out that Xing Yunfei actually has a wife and a son.
Yeah, you don't even find that out until the second to last paragraph.
And you're like, wait a second,
where do these people come from? His wife is like, oh, you're with your rock. All right, that's cool. Go ahead. What kind of marriage is this?
Yeah, so the argument that one of our professors, Marm Epstein, says is essentially this is a story of Qing.
Yeah.
Qing is, how do we explain Qing? It's like feelings.
Emotional connection.
Yeah.
Affect.
Yeah, something like that. But this is, the thing about it is, Qing is one of those things that you can have towards inanimate objects, and inanimate objects can have back towards you. It's when he's constantly losing the stone, or people are trying to steal the stone seems to be trying to evade the people who are stealing the stone as much as Xing Yunfei is trying to get the stone back. The first thief comes in, sends a servant to grab it and snatches it out from him. But as they're going across the river, that servant suddenly loses hold of it, or he puts it down on a bridge and it falls over, and it's not really clear from the Chinese language whether or not that fall was something that the rock did intentionally or whether it was the servant who dropped him into the river. But it's clear from the passage after that so the man who wanted the stone beats the servant, and then he searches for the stone in the river, but he can't find it, and he leaves up a notice saying, hey, reward if you find this particular stone, and he doesn't ever find it. So the stone is essentially hiding from him. The stone wants to be with Xing Yunfei. I don't even know what pronoun to use. This is such an interesting, considering our discussion of pronouns today in contemporary society. How do you describe a stone with subjectivity?
An animate stone. Although, of course, the author never describes the stone thinking, feeling, acting. It doesn't describe it in any agency. Not directly. We don't see. And then the stone said.
There are some points where it's implied.
It's implied. That's what I mean, though. It's never stated directly. So a story about Qing, a story about connection between a man and a rock. But this, you had to admit, this is a very strange rock. It's not just a rock. It's not like he finds a beautiful jade or something. It's a rock with holes in it.
The holes seem to indicate some sort of fate that the rock and Xing Yunfei share together, because the rock has the number of holes that Xing Yunfei is supposed to live. Mm-hmm. And when 3 of those holes are marked off, he loses 3 years of his life.
It's hard not to see it as almost an allegory on sexual connection between a man and a woman as well, because you have a rock with holes. The way it's described, at least the way it's translated in the beginning, even if you don't know much about this particular genre of writing, it's a very peculiar way to describe and position a stone.
If I can push back against that a little. So as the resident Freudian here at the China Literature Podcast, I actually don't want to read this in a Freudian manner.
I think we're about to switch hats. This is disturbing.
Oh my goodness. So there's something going on here. I definitely agree. There is a weird thing, almost sexual, between them. But I don't think that the story requires us to read it that way.
I'm not reading it as a specifically sexual connection.
But I don't think it's even allegorical in some sense. It's just about a man who loves his rocks and he finds the rock.
You're right. That's not Freudian at all. That's not at all Freudian.
He finds his true love rock.
Okay, I'm going to read just a sentence here, the very beginning of the story. Actually, I'll just read this when he finds the rock, just so we're thing here. So this is from the translation. One day when he was fishing in a river, something caught in his net. He dived into the water and came up with a stone about 1 foot in diameter, exquisite from all angles with picturesque ridges and peaks. He loved it as dearly as if he had found a treasure. He had a red sandalwood stand carved for it and put it on the desk so he could admire it. Now, here's the weird one. Here's why I read this as allegorical of a connection between a man and a woman. Whenever it was about to rain, clouds would emerge from each of its holes, which looked from a distance like new cotton stuffed in the openings. Now, in the Ming and the Qing, especially with our Huaban, our short vernacular short stories, one of the metaphors, one of the idioms that's used to describe the sexual act is the clouds and the rain. Mm. And I don't see how you can avoid clouds coming out of the holes in a rock that a man is in love with as not suggestive, or at least funny.
I see your point. I don't want to close off other readings.
Sure. Totally. That's why I'm curious how you read it, because we talked beforehand. I was thinking, I want to see what you do with this, because you're actually in the class where you're talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I noticed when I first read it, I noticed the details about the moisture the clouds coming out of the holes. And if I remember correctly, when someone else steals the stone, someone who's not the rightful owner.
Right, clouds don't come out anymore.
Don't come out, right. Yeah, which is, if we take the Freudian reading, the sexual reading, it's definitely something going on here. Mm-hmm. But I want to, I guess, emphasize that, a man can really love his stone. And I think that's what this story, I mean, he's playing with these sexual metaphors, maybe. Definitely. I think he's definitely playing with sexual metaphors. But I just want to be able to read it on the literal level. And I think there's something interesting really going on here, because the stone, if we just read it as a stone and we don't do the whole sexual thing, the stone is just this kind of like weird object that he can have a relationship with. And one of the things we argued about before is Deberry and individualism in China. And he makes the claim, he talks about like sort of what it means to have a sort of individuality mm-hmm. in early modern China, so in Ming-Qing China. And I guess the thing that I don't want to close off by reading it sexually is, lots of people have sexual feelings. That's just kind of the nature of humans. But there's really something very inspiring by seeing a man who says, like, I guess I'll do that whole man and wife thing and I'll have a son and do the Confucian thing, but that's not what my life is going to be about. My life is going to be about rocks. I'm going to just love rocks, and I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to be that individual. It allows a space for individuality that I think is important, and that's what I get out of it.
I guess what's peculiar to me, though, is that reading would make a lot more sense if the stone wasn't described the way it was.
You mean with the holes?
It's got holes, the way it reacts, and the way... Let me throw something on the top of that as well. When we were reading a lot more Huaban, one of the texts that we were reading as a sort of a reference point was Tina Lu's Accidental Incest was the name of the book. And one of the arguments, we didn't like a lot of the stuff in the book, but one of the arguments I found very interesting is that in this particular period of writing, one of the things that allows individuality to happen is commodity exchange. That it's the interaction during the late Ming, early Qing. There's a much greater presence of markets,
the expanse of the market.
Yeah, because the land is expanding, the territories are expanding,
and there's an expansion of the monetary markets because of silver coming in from Mexico.
Yeah,
through the Spanish
exactly.
Empire.
So that one of her arguments is that whenever you see someone with some sense of individuality, it's usually negotiated by a thing, by a pearl-sewn shirt, by a boat, by a thing. What's curious in this story is that this is an object that resists commodification. Whenever in the story there's an attempt to sell it, it backfires. No one's able to sell it. No one's able to buy it. The stone always returns to the person that, we'll use the word, loves it. And that's peculiar. For me, that's either indicative of a commitment between both parties that is very strong, in which case this would be the single strongest relationship in early modern vernacular fiction in China. But it is very curious.
Yeah. No, I think that brings an interesting level to it, the sort of idea of commodity exchange and how commodity exchange just doesn't really work here. You've got the stone that should be, a commodity.
It's priceless. Not priceless, but you could sell it for a lot of money.
Right, but Xing Yunfei specifically says, I'm not going to sell this for any money. It doesn't matter if you give me 10,000 ounces of silver. I don't want to sell it. And it resists any sort of commodification. The stone itself seems to resist it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in most other stories with a thing that becomes a commodity, like the classic example is the story about the pearl sewn shirt. The shirt is not the focus of the story. It's what enables the story to happen. Here, the stone really is the focus of the story. I don't know if I see any direct agency on the part of the stone, but it is.
I definitely feel like there's agency.
There's agency implied, but it's not characterized the same way that the human beings in the story are characterized, whether because no one would believe it or I don't know, whatever.
I think the language there's a sort of ambiguity in the original Chinese that allows for a little bit more play than maybe the English translation does. So I guess one thing we should point out is this is written in classical Chinese, so Wen Wen. So I'm a really bad reader of classical. You are also.
It's very hard. Even if you're good at it, it's hard.
But I wanted to bring back a discussion. I wanted to bring up another point. Do you think, so we talked about Huaben a lot before. This is different from Huaben.
This is very different, yeah.
It's different linguistically.
Yeah.
But how do you think that plays out in the story itself? Like in the content?
I personally, this is an interesting story, but I didn't enjoy it very much simply because it leaps around so much. It's an interesting string of events, but I don't feel any attachment to any one in the story. The guy just seems it's not psychotic, but it's really just very strange. This guy has this weird fetish for a stone, and that's what drives the story.
Yeah, I liked it a lot more than you did, but I definitely see your point. There is a sort of element of classical language in this where it's just kind of like not giving you all of the information. Like, I'd really like to know a lot more. But the story resists that.
Yeah, it does.
I guess the language itself resists that kind of thing.
And I guess that's what leads me largely to read this allegorically. This is my lack of familiarity with the tradition as well, but I can't help it. This is how I read it.
Sure.
As sort of allegorical of a marriage relationship, possibly that of a mistress, where you have a bond which, if structured correctly, like we talked about in another podcast, has an in and an out. There's a containment. And this is a good example of whenever containment is broken, things don't go well. But the stone always returns. No matter what happens, the stone is always back where it should be. And it doesn't have a function, quote unquote. It is there purely for Xing Yunfei. It does not have its own thing that it does. And at this particular time, like all of the Huaben stories we read, now I'll say all that we've read, that doesn't mean all that there are. All that we've read, I don't recall an example of a woman who has a real purpose aside from simply being in the home for her husband. Can you think of any others like that? I can't think of any.
Well, I guess we have to distinguish between a woman having a purpose on her own, or like her having her own ideas. Because certainly lots of the women that we've seen have sort of their own ideas of how things should be, and like,
True.
and they resist sort of the state of the male imposed ideals of marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But for the most part, I think the norm is exactly what we see here. Now, why it's necessary that this be a stone?
That's one of the things I was going to ask. So
yeah.
I have a theory.
Let's hear it.
So in the news industry, they say, if it bleeds, it leads. And so, I mean, I guess maybe if what we're talking about, if what you're saying is that this is an allegory for a sort of marital relationship, it's an allegory for a perfect kind of marriage, right? Like,
and yet it's yes, but it's also funny because it's a rock.
but the only way you can tell this story is if about a perfect marriage, if it has something weird going on.
Yes,
it has to be.
Yeah.
The story of a man and his love for his rock and his rock's love for him. If it was just about a man and a woman in love,
it would not work.
It would be really boring.
It would be extremely boring.
I mean, if you actually we could rewrite this story completely and just replace the rock with the woman, and it would just be like dead. I mean, like it would be kind of interesting because people are constantly coming in there trying to steal the rock, and so they would be like stealing the woman. But then, like, you know, like. You know, it's not that interesting. And like, would she stay underwater all for like weeks and then suddenly like appear and disappear? Pusong Ling could do it. I'm sure there's a.
Would clouds still emerge? I don't know, but it's interesting.
Which holes would they emerge from?
Oh my gosh, I wasn't going to go there, but you know, you went there, so you're the Freudian. That's your prerogative. But it's one of the interesting comparisons I think of when we're talking about this. Is the Li Yu story, which we also have a podcast on. This is the male Mencius's mother moves her son 3 times.
Yeah.
In which you have arguably
the exact same thing.
Exactly. The ideal relationship, except that they're both dudes.
Yeah.
And it's that way that it's almost like writers from this era, even when positioning a perfect relationship, understand that if I do this, no one's going to read it because it's boring. So let's tweak it.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Like, just a little bit. Let's make them 2 men in a Confucian society that wouldn't allow that, and also a man on a rock. That'll, you know.
No. I think there's definitely something to that. I think we're seeing if I could say it, a theme.
A theme.
In late imperial Chinese literature.
Yeah.
Like, to tell the story of a perfect relationship, there has to be something that's a little off.
And it's really not even... I would say that's not even a unique thing in China. I mean, if you know, even in our own history, if you really want to tell a story that everyone's going to read, you can't have the perfect monogamous relationship where both partners are faithful and nothing ever happens. That's not a story.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to do it, but I'm going to evoke the beginning of Anna Karenina, the first sentence. You know, all happy families are happy in the exact same way.
Yeah.
Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I've read the entire book, so I can quote it. We can discuss it. But yeah, I think maybe this is sort of the Anna Karenina effect.
It could be. I mean, Tolstoy very definitely with that book has what amounts to almost an ideal relationship with Kitty and Levin. But there has to be a foil. If the entire book is Kitty and Levin, it's fair enough. It's a fun story, but nothing like if they're put against each other, these 2 stories.
But what we're seeing in the Li Yu story, the male Mencius's mother, and this story, the rare stone from heaven, is that at least in these 2 Chinese authors, they're not going with like comparing a good relationship with a horrific relationship like Tolstoy does. They're going with, let's take this perfect relationship and make it something that you never thought of.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you have any other concluding remarks?
That's I'm done.
So, Rob, you thought this was a pretty weird story. Would you still encourage the reader to read it?
I don't know. I'll be honest. I really don't know. But it is. I'll say that it's worth looking into if your entire experience of Chinese literature is sort of realist fiction.
Yeah.
You should definitely read some Pusong Lin to balance that.
I'm going to have to say I really liked this story. I found the romance kind of weirdly nice.
Oh, man.
On that note, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.